Susan Tamarkin Goodman is Senior Curator Emerita at the Jewish Museum, where she has organized numerous exhibitions and written and edited many, many catalogs. Her exhibitions and catalogs number 3 on Marc Chagall. Chagall and the Artists of the Russian Jewish Theater from 2008, Marc Chagall Early Works from Russian Collection in 2001, and the 2013 exhibition, Chagall, Love, War, and Exile. And this is actually the catalog, and this is the same period that the works that are on loan here from Jay and Jeannie Schottenstein in Gallery 7, which I hope you've all seen. It's from the same period, so I think this is going to provide wonderful context for those paintings. But the book is available in the shop if you're interested. It's quite wonderful. One critic called this exhibition a groundbreaking examination of the artist's work during wartime. And another commented, the new show of Marc Chagall's work at the Jewish Museum, New York, curated by Susan Goodman, does not try to challenge the popularly held image we have of Chagall, but it does complicate it. To a large degree, it succeeds at reminding the viewer that the artist was a more serious thinker and his work more nuanced, darker, angrier, and full of despair than is generally thought to be the case. And I think we'll see some of that tonight. In addition to exhibitions and essays on Chagall and Russian art, Susan has also worked extensively on the subject of Israeli art and on Jewish artists in the 19th century Europe. She received her BA from the University of Pennsylvania and MA from Columbia University. And I honestly can think of no one better qualified to talk about this period and the work of Chagall than Susan Tamarkin Goodman.
Thank you so much, Carol. It's a pleasure to be here, and it was great to get acquainted with your collection. Particularly, I was delighted to see the Schottenstein paintings on the wall, and they were the Chagall paintings, quite terrific. And let's talk about Chagall. Marc Chagall lived to be 97 years old. Until his death in 1985, he continued to draw upon images and experiences from his early years. He immortalized life in his small Belarusian town, perpetuating the memories of his upbringing, so that when he left his native land for good in 1922, he carried within him the imprint of his early life. Chagall wrote his autobiography, My Life, at the age of 30. He had already been painting it for more than a decade. It was as if his earliest experiences, his family, the tumble-down wooden houses of Vitebsk, the view across the Dvina River, the animals, synagogues, and peasants, his eccentric family, all provided him with enough documentation for life. Chagall's childhood years in Vitebsk, Russia, entailed the gradual shedding of his family's religious traditions. The impact of disparate and sometimes conflicting influences began to inform his life at an early age. This drawing from 1911 of the artist in front of Vitebsk Cathedral indicates that from his youth, some aspects of the dominant Russian and Western European culture seeped into Chagall's consciousness. Although his own neighborhood was largely Jewish, the town's Russian Orthodox churches were omnipresent. For a Jew growing up in late 19th or early 20th century Russia, the local church was more than a picturesque landmark. The periodic pogroms against Jews and even the expulsions were largely incited by the church. Thus, its buildings, with their ornate domes and icons, represented the threat of hate and violence. Nonetheless, young Chagall would often flout Jewish prohibitions and visit local churches where he was deeply moved by the visual impact of the icons and stained glass windows. A sensitivity to his minority status in Russia seems to have fashioned Chagall's identity and worldview, leading to a strong desire to enter mainstream culture. By 1908, Chagall decided he had to leave his family and the provincial world of Vitebsk and move on to St. Petersburg, which was oriented toward Western culture. There's Chagall. It was on a visit home from St. Petersburg in the autumn of 1909 that a new person entered Chagall's world. Bella Rosenfeld was the daughter of a wealthy Jewish jeweler from Vitebsk. This encounter was the beginning of a remarkable romance that was to endure for 35 years. From the day they met, they seemed to cease walking on the ground and soared over Vitebsk, Paris, Moscow, Leningrad, Berlin, and finally New York. The birthday depicts the weightless world into which these lovers were rocketed. By the spring of 1911, when his teacher Leon Bakst left St. Petersburg for Paris to join Diaghilev's ballet company, Chagall also felt the need to visit the art capital. In exchange for a single painting and a drawing, his patron, Maxime Binever, offered Chagall a stipend that would enable him to spend the next 4 years in Paris. It was here, in the years before World War I, that he developed his unique style. From the start, primed by the exhibitions he had seen in St. Petersburg, and having studied the latest paintings at the Salon d'Automne in Paris, he instinctively chose the most avant-garde groups to join, absorbing fauve color and cubist faceting and blending them convincingly with his own folk style. It was during this period that the headless bodies, Fiddler on the Roof, two-faced heads, and flying cows became his signature motifs. For the French artists and critics, the results were strikingly modern, and they welcomed Chagall readily into the avant-garde fold, exhibiting his new Paris works at the Salon des Indépendants in March 1912. But despite this, Chagall remained alienated from his surroundings, and his main themes during the Paris period often concerned non-Jewish Russian peasants, such as the drunkard, painted in an overtly folk style, or the soldier drinks in which cubist elements were added. On the one hand, he emphasized his cosmopolitan sophistication, while on the other, he stressed his childlike folk nature. In Paris, everything took on new life, and this self-portrait entitled Presentation certainly gives an indication of Chagall's new worldview. The freedom of being thousands of miles from his homeland afforded Chagall the luxury of nostalgia from afar. As the painting The Violinist demonstrates, in this different milieu, the grimness, poverty, and religious fanaticism of the Hasidic Jews in Vitebsk took on surreal overtones. What saved him from sentimentality was the fact that his pictorial intelligence did not stop at the idealistic reconfiguring of the reality he had left behind in Russia. Instead of picturesque Vitebsk, we get phantasmagorical Vitebsk, viewed through the filter of Chagall's mind. He had the capacity for capturing the essence of his youth, of being able to reveal the joy in the most trivial, everyday scene, that a poor provincial shtetl, with its winding streets, its insular houses, and people bowed down by poverty, could be depicted with beauty and poetry in the eyes of the beholder, in the eyes of the painter. I think this is what enchants us. Painted the year after Chagall came to Paris, let's see. I in the Village evokes memories of his native Hasidic community in Vitebsk. It seems to float above, while a diaphanous cow goat appears at the left. In the village, peasants and animals lived side by side in a mutual dependence. here signified by the line from peasant to cow connecting their eyes. For Hasids, animals are humanity's link to the universe, and the painting's large circular forms suggest the orbiting sun, moon, and earth. The eye of the title wears a necklace from which a cross dangles and can be seen in the extreme lower right. Let's see if I can see it. It's down here. However, the same eye wears a ring decorated with a stone cut into a freely arranged six-pointed Jewish star. Very hard to see, I acknowledge. It's right there. Although the work depicts Russian rather than Jewish subjects, clearly he remained extremely conscious of his Jewish identity. It seems paradoxical that soon after he arrived in Paris and was just beginning to paint some of his most avant-garde works, Chagall also chose to represent Christian subjects, notably Jesus, as a symbol of Jewish persecution. Indeed, the image of the crucifixion was an expedient means of conveying to mankind, which implied the Christian world, the pain of the Jews. Because Christianity was central to the European cultural tradition, it attracted many Jews during the modern period. In fact, many even converted to Christianity. Chagall was not one of these, since he was deeply connected to his Jewish roots. He chose the alternative of asserting his ethnic rather than religious roots and absorbing them into his art as a form of identity and a statement of belief. But culturally, the Christian world was a tangible reality in his work, resulting in the many fusions of Jewish, Russian, and Christian elements in his paintings. In Calvary, he portrays the Holy Family with himself as Christ child, along with his own parents. Some Jewish critics were puzzled, even outraged, by the use of Christian motifs in the work of a Jewish artist like Chagall. But he insisted he was not trying to be provocative, and that it was the most effective means of conveying his feelings of distress at the anti-Jewish pogroms in many parts of Europe and the Tsarist Empire. After 4 fruitful years in Paris, Chagall returned to Vitebsk in 1914 for the sole purpose of claiming his fiancée Bella and returning with her to the life he had left in Paris. But shortly after his arrival in Russia, the war in Europe erupted and travel across borders was curtailed. His 3-month homecoming was transformed into an 8-year stay. He was trapped in Vitebsk with no visible means of support. Although he was known in avant-garde European circles, his major new works had never been shown in Russian. Chagall soon overcame his initial boredom at being confined to his native town. He began to rediscover and record his roots in Vitebsk in a series of about 50 works which he called documents. Back among his co-religionists, he was happy for a while to be absorbed in the familiarity of Vitebsk, which took the place of the foreignness of Paris. These were fairly straightforward depictions of his family and scenes of the life and landscape of Vitebsk, drawn on cardboard and paper. Despite the hardships of living in the Soviet Union following the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution, Chagall continued his creative development, finding an outlet in the theater. In 1920, he accepted a commission from the State Jewish Chamber Theater in Moscow to design the set and costumes for its inaugural production, An Evening of One-Act Plays by Sholem Aleichem. Seeking to create a synthesis between the stage and the walls that encompass the stage, he created figurative scenery that occupied the walls of the entire theater. These 4 vertical panels hung next to each other on the walls of the theater. Each bears a single image symbolizing the 4 arts. Chagall's muses are literature on the right, portrayed by a Torah scribe who sits bent over a scroll, theater represented by a bodkin or professional jester, popular at Jewish weddings, and dance on the left, in which a matchmaker at a wedding claps her hands while dancing to a popular Jewish tune, and music showing a violinist, a perennial player at Jewish weddings. But the country had become a very different place from the world of the artist's youth, and he began to chafe under the increasingly restrictive state controls over the art world. These conditions motivated Chagall and Bella and their young child, Ida, to leave their home in the Soviet Union and move to Paris in 1923. In fact, the murals for the Moscow Jewish Theater were the last major masterpiece that the artist created in the Soviet Union. When Chagall reappeared in Berlin and Paris in 1922 and 1923, the art world was amazed that he was still alive, as it was widely believed that he had been killed in the Russian Civil War. But his reputation was assured from the highly regarded work he had created during his first period in Paris from 1911 to 1914. This painting, Time is a River Without Banks, references an obscure quote from Ovid, which seems to encapsulate Chagall's frame of mind during his second period in France. I believe the concept that nothing stands still and that years passing like flowing water would have resonated with the artist who had chosen to leave his native land and his entire family behind in Vitebsk. Throughout these years, nostalgia for his childhood home continued to inflect his work. Time is a River Without Banks is a surreal rendering of seemingly unrelated images, which actually contains intensely personal references brought into focus by the artist. The grandfather clock, an intimidating presence from his parents' dining room in Vitebsk, floats above the river Dvina. The winged fish can be connected to Chagall's father, who worked as a laborer in a herring warehouse. Although Chagall was never able to return to Vitebsk, an exile resulted in permanent separation from the sources of his paintings. This also provided an opportunity to create a body of work out of his own store of remembered images. And in fact, during this second period in France, Chagall painted a number of replicas and new versions of work that he had made earlier in Paris and in Russia. Chagall spent a productive period in France with his wife and daughter, lasting through the 1920s and 1930s. There he flourished and built a celebrated career. Paris became a second home, and Chagall began to acclimatize to French artistic tradition and culture by painting joyous, lyrical compositions, including scenes of lovers and floral still lifes. Although Chagall remained committed to Russian culture, language, and the world of his childhood, France was now his home, and he used every opportunity to embrace his new country. In Russia, profusion of flowers, such as the ones in this painting, were rare and would have been a luxury. However, in France, Chagall was surrounded by flowers, and his paintings were often based on the lavish bouquets Bella brought home each day from the market. Chagall liked to work indoors, but in his paintings, the flower arrangements are often positioned outdoors before a blue sky, with a deep space extending beyond the flowers. This lush painting by Chagall from the Schottenstein collection was created many years later, but it's an indication of the continuing importance of flowers in Chagall's work. Here, a huge floral bouquet still dominates the painting. However, it shares the space with structures on the horizon and a female figure in the foreground. Painted during his second period in Paris in 1923, the version on the right of the green violinist is related to the earlier canvas in the middle that he painted in 1920 in Moscow for the State Jewish Theater. It also relates to an even earlier fiddler painted during his initial period in Paris in 1912. Chagall emphasized the importance of a violinist or klezmer for Russian villages where there are no orchestras. They were mainly traveling musicians who were poor and moved from village to village. The violin was easy to transport, and these nomadic musicians are an integral part of Jewish folklore, conveying the nostalgia that prevails in Chagall's work. The violinist personifies not just music, but the arts in general. Years later, Chagall remembered he chose the green color of the violinist's face for psychic and plastic reasons, and he said that green was an arbitrary and poetic color. Although Chagall, Bella, and their daughter Ida were leading a comfortable and productive life in France, on the eve of World War II, Chagall felt the new world he had discovered in Paris collapsing under the restraints posed by the rise of Nazism. Chagall's work increasingly appeared to be questioning the certainties acquired over the last 15 years. Compositions filled with joy and wonder gave way to works expressing this disruption he felt in France. Old Man with Beard from 1931 drew on a chance encounter remembered from his years in Russia. The scene is generalized and timeless, with few identifying details, yet the tilt of the head and the hand gesture suggest a tone of resignation. The most paradigmatic work from the early 1930s is Solitude, in which a Jew enveloped in his prayer shawl sits forlorn, cradling a Torah. The angel flies away, seeming to abandon the Jew to his fate, while the cow playing the violin consoles him. Vitebsk is identified by the steeples of the Olinskaya Cathedral. Aware of the spread of fascism across Europe, Solitude is a harbinger of the dire events to come and a testament to Chagall's early acknowledgement of the seriousness of this historical moment in Europe. In 1937, after a number of earlier attempts, Chagall and Bella were finally granted French citizenship. But by this time, it was clear that war was imminent and they could no longer risk remaining in the country that had given them sanctuary. In 1939, Chagall finally showed sufficient concern about his possible arrest to collect the paintings from his studio, remove them from their stretchers, and take them in a taxi to the town of Saint-Denis-sur-Loire, which was about 80 miles from Paris. After only 3 years as French citizens, anti-Semitic legislation adopted by France during 1940 stripped Jews of their citizenship, making Chagall's family situation even more dangerous. The advent of World War II marked the end of Paris as the paramount place for artists to live and work. Fire in the Snow from 1940 is an indication of his awareness of Europe's catastrophic situation. This painting's depiction of violence and disruption is characteristic of Chagall's wartime work, which often drew from the artist's own experience of pogroms and other acts of bigotry. Though Chagall's subjects during this time can be dark, at the same time it was a period of great creative activity for the artist. The war reached France when Chagall was at the peak of his career. He was 53 years old. His acquaintances were amongst the intellectual elite. He had received the Carnegie Prize, and his major retrospective had been held at the Kunsthalle in Basel. Although Chagall used various familiar representational images in his response to political events, the most pervasive and recurring theme was Jesus on the cross. As the dire events in Europe unfolded, Chagall was increasingly drawn to the image of the crucifixion and its portrayal of agony as he desperately attempted to awaken the world to the perilous situation of Jews in the wake of the Nazi genocide. The artist frequently stressed the Jewish identity of Jesus by replacing his traditional loincloth with a Jewish prayer shawl, as seen in these crucifixions. although he was appropriating the central motif of Christian iconography, the crucifixion images were not an expression of Christian theology for Chagall. Rather, the artist argued that he had painted a Jewish Jesus who understood Jewish pain. Quote, "For me, Christ has always symbolized the true type of the Jewish martyr," end quote. And the image of the crucified Jesus held symbolic meaning, bringing to the work aspects of martyrdom, tragedy, and suffering. In June, 1 month after the invasion of the occupation of France and the establishment of the collaborationist Vichy government in the south of the country, Chagall purchased a former Catholic girls' school in Gourd, a 17th century village perched high on a rocky incline in Provence, far from the German border. Like many French Jews, Chagall hoped to wait out the war in southern France. However, he also sensed that it was only a matter of time before he became a target of the Nazis, and although he expressed great reluctance to travel to a land that had neither cows nor trees, he secured an exit visa. By leaving France for the United States, but leaving France for the United States was not simple. Beside the exit visa, he needed an invitation from an American sponsor. Chagall was one of a number of French artists and writers identified by Alfred Barr, director of the Museum of Modern Art in New York, as needing sponsorship to emigrate. Barr provided an invitation to Chagall, as well as the promise of an exhibition of his work. This was delivered to him through Varian Fry, the regional director of the Emergency Rescue Committee, and Hiram Bingham, the American Consul General in Marseille. As Chagall and Bella were fleeing in the wake of the French surrender to Germany, their route took them to Marseille, where he was arrested briefly but soon released. En route to the ship in Lisbon, Chagall created this sketch, conflating the New Testament story of Christ forced to carry the cross to his crucifixion with brutal images of Nazi deportations. In mid-June 1941, none too soon, and with the help of Varian Fry and the Emergency Rescue Committee, the Chagalls were able to depart from Lisbon for New York on the SS Pinto Basto. Marc and Bella finally disembarked in New York, June 23, 1941, the very day the German forces invaded their Russian motherland. They had crossed the Atlantic with hundreds of other Jewish refugees. Pierre Matisse, who was the youngest son of Henri Matisse and gallery owner, met them at the dock. It is somewhat miraculous that Chagall's paintings ever reached America. 3 months later, Ida and her husband, Michael Rappaport, booked passage on the SS Navamar, a Spanish freighter that managed to carry more than 1,100 Jews anxious to flee Europe. Passengers recall a huge box on the deck of the ship, vigilantly guarded by Ida. I mean, you could just imagine if this box had been below deck, what could have happened. In a new country, Chagall found it easiest to get started again by reworking some of the paintings that he had started in France and taken unfinished to America. Bella was a major influence since she recalled and had strong opinions about the earlier works from Europe. Despite the warm welcome he received in the United States, Chagall did not adapt with ease to life here. The feeling of exile was exacerbated by Chagall's linguistic inadequacy. He never mastered more than rudimentary English, and he continued to seek out individuals with whom he could speak French, Russian, or Yiddish. Chagall's breakthrough in the United States came in the spring of 1942, when Russian choreographer Leonid Massin invited him to design the scenery and costumes for a New York Ballet Theater production of Alecko, based on Pushkin's poem The Gypsy, with music by Tchaikovsky. It was notable for its striking modernist designs and vibrant colors. Chagall transformed familiar motifs from his painting to reflect the spacious, flowing movements of Massin's choreography. he created 4 monumental backdrops that set the poetic and chromatic tone for each of the ballet's 4 scenes. In Wheatfield on a summer's afternoon, 2 fiery suns dominate a landscape that includes the lover's little boat gliding across water. And the mural for the final scene, A Fantasy of St. Petersburg, creates a tragic mood. In it, a white horse with chariot wheels for its back legs streaks across the sky over a burning town into a black night sky illuminated by a golden chandelier. The ballet was planned for New York, but the mounting costs were too high, and Chagall wasn't a member of the Screen Painters Union, so the production was moved to Mexico, where qualified labor could be found for less. Chagall, Bella, and the entire troupe traveled to Mexico to complete work on the production. The artist was deeply impressed and influenced by Mexico's vivid color contrasts and intense sun, all of which found their way into the Aleco sets and costumes. The Fall of the Angel is one of the largest easel paintings of Chagall's career. It is a work that he began in 1923 in Europe, and he reworked it after settling in America. The photograph of the painting in an earlier state shows that the subject grew progressively darker with each version, reflecting the deepening human tragedy of those years. In its final state, the central figure, originally a human, becomes a stricken, fiery angel who plummets to earth with her wings spread wide past a crucified Jesus, while a terrified figure snatches up an open Torah and carries it out of the zone of apocalyptic fury. Chagall biographer and son-in-law Franz Meyer called it the allegory of an age of terror and cited a parallel between the cosmic catastrophe of the angel's fall and European history of the period. In 1943, word arrived of the destruction of the Warsaw Ghetto. The news from Europe was relentlessly grim, and Chagall responded accordingly in the war. Here, his distress regarding the effects of the destruction and devastation on civilian life is reflected in the shtetl scene, which has been transformed into an image of brutality and disaster. An individual lies in the snow in the form of a crucified body, while chaos reigns in the surrounding village. The Flight into Egypt is a painting filled with personal references to his own escape from war-torn France to the United States. Evoking the Bible story of the flight of Joseph and Mary from Bethlehem to Egypt with baby Jesus to escape the massacre of the innocents, Chagall sets the scene of departure in a desolate, snow-covered Eastern European village under cover of night. Joseph is depicted as a harlequin, one of many instances where a forlorn clown or ragged fiddler appears to express a painful vulnerability. Quote, "I have always looked upon clowns, acrobats, and actors as beings with a tragic humanity." Apocalypse in Lilac represents a unique iteration on the Jewish Jesus theme. It dates to the liberation of the death camps in 1944, as well as the subsequent media reports about gas chambers and crematoria. It is significant in its inclusion of details based on these revelations. A naked Jesus in a prayer shawl and phylacteries appears to peer down at the Nazi soldier attempting to remove the ladder from the cross. Symbols of Jewish suffering appear all about him. By 1944, it was known that 1.7 million had been murdered at Auschwitz alone. Chagall was racked with shame and guilt from sitting out the war in physical comfort in America. Years later, Chagall wrote a poem for the slaughtered artists as a eulogy for Jewish artists killed in the Holocaust, evoking with bitterness the German art tradition which was betrayed by the Nazis. I see them, trudging alone in rags, barefoot on mute roads, the brothers of Israel's, Pissarro and Modigliani, our brothers, pulled with ropes by the sons of Durer, Chronic, and Holbein to death in the crematoria. In 1944, as the destruction of both Vitebsk and the Warsaw Ghetto was taking place, Chagall set the crucified in a devastated landscape of slaughter. The bodies of Jews are shown crucified in the streets of their shtetl and in front of their own homes. Although related in their pose to the Jewish Jesus, they actually represent the crucifixion of Eastern European Jews themselves. In this dead village street, strewn with corpses, a living Jew clings to his Torah, surveying the scene from a rooftop. He's not a fiddler on a roof, but a witness, perhaps representing Chagall himself. Chagall and Bella were at Cranberry Lake in the Adirondacks in 1944 when they heard the news of the liberation of France, and immediately they decided to return to Paris. But the ultimate irony was that just a few days prior to their planned departure, Bella became deathly ill with a viral infection. Medication reserved for returning American servicemen and women was in short supply, and she died in 3 days. Chagall described this sudden tragedy, quote, "A violent clap of thunder and a brief downpour burst at 6 o'clock in the evening when on September 2nd, 1944, Bella left this world. Everything went black before my eyes." We have to remember that Bella was Chagall's muse, his critic, supporter of his career, and his most intimate companion. In 1931, she translated her husband's autobiography, My Life, from Russian into French, and wrote her own memoir, Burning Lights, in Yiddish, which she finished just before her death in 1944. In 1941, the year after the couple arrived in New York, Bella began to write in a small hardcover sketchbook. On the first 8 pages, she translated French poetry into Yiddish as a means of preserving the past, since both France and her native Belarus were now out of reach. The sketchbook was found after her death, and in a final expression of their mutual bond, Chagall appropriated it for his own use. That he continued to use the sketchbook for 20 years after Bella's death attests to its importance as a link to his longtime muse. Embracing his recent loss, The Marriage, which is, you may recognize from the Schottenstein collection, was painted the year after Bella's death. It can be seen to represent the triumph of love over death. In this imaginary reunion, Chagall tenderly embraces his bride. In the foreground, flowers fill the space, a testament to their abiding love. Concerned about her father, following Bella's death in 1944, Ida hired a young French-speaking British woman, Virginia Haggard McNeil, to look after him. The daughter of a British diplomat, she had studied art in Paris. At the time, she was married to an impoverished painter and was obliged to support herself and her young daughter as a housekeeper. Chagall welcomed this companionship, and they soon began a romance. In March 1946, Chagall bought a modest house in High Falls in New York's Mid-Hudson Valley, and Virginia and her daughter joined him there. Their son, David, was born that June and named in memory of Chagall's brother. They lived there together from 1946 to 1948. This new romantic stimulus was what he needed. And when Saul Hurok approached Chagall once again in 1945 to create the costumes and backdrop for the Firebird at the Ballet Theater, he was able to emerge from his despair and come to grips with the monumentality of this ballet in all its splendor. It was the first major project to which he devoted himself after Bella's death. Based on a Russian folktale with music by Stravinsky, Firebird brought him back to his Russian roots. Yet his designs for the fiery love story took a fresh erotic direction as he worked with Virginia at his side. Virginia remembers Chagall listening to Stravinsky's music throughout the summer of 1945. She has written that she watched a bird woman emerge with outstretched wings against an ultramarine sky. Familiar, fantastic hybrid figures reappear in various strong colors and patterns. The ballet's passion echoed Chagall's own emotional turbulence, and his painting for Firebird allows him to manifest through form and color the message at the heart of the Firebird, the life-affirming power of love. The production of Firebird opened at the Metropolitan Opera House in October 1945. In the curtain design, the Firebird with her wings spread against a vast blue night sky seems to merge with a woman with an inverted head whose features resemble Bella's. In the glimmer of approaching dawn, there is a horseman and the suggestion of roofs and domes of a sleeping village, as well as various creatures hiding in the shadows beneath the black moon. When Chagall finally returned to his easel following Bella's death, much of his work took the form of tributes to his late wife. Another painting by Chagall in the Schottenstein collection is Sleepwalker. This homage to Bella, in which the faces of husband and wife have merged, has a melancholy overtone. A wooden Vitebsk shack is illuminated in the lower portion of the painting, revealing a red cock and other familiar Chagall symbols. But now the work is imbued with sadness. A bluish-black tone suffuses the scene, and the sources of light in the form of moon and chandelier seem to be elements in the sleepwalker's frozen dream. The Soul of the City is an even more anguished work, depicting the artist longing for his wife, who floats nearby but is beyond his grasp. The artist appears to have two faces, one turned toward the easel, bearing a half-finished crucifixion scene, the other toward the ghost of his black-haired wife, who descends from a Torah scroll wearing bridal white. Below, a brown-haired woman, representing Virginia, holds a cock tenderly in her arms. The artist's ambivalence about the end of his old life and the beginning of a new family with Virginia is poignantly expressed here. The figure on the cross bears little resemblance to Chagall's earlier Jesus figures. It evokes not the pain of Jesus or universal suffering, but Chagall's own grief at the death of Bella. Begun before World War II, Bride and Groom on Cock was reworked over the span of many years and completed when the artist was living in High Falls. These were years of great happiness, when the painter Virginia, her daughter Jean, and David settled into a brief but productive and gratifying period. This lyrical nuptial picture, in which the man and woman ascend into the night sky riding an enormous cock, is an affirmation of life and love, marking the beginning of his emotional recovery from the traumas of that terrible time. The cock, a folk symbol of physical love and fertility, began to appear as a dominant compositional feature. Chagall's love of life, so absent during the war years and following Bella's death, gradually returned. Cow with Parasol, which epitomizes the artist's work as a fantasist and a colorist, reflects his continued interest in folk art. The cow or ox is a frequent figure in his panoply of characters, often an image of kindness, joy, and innocence. Here her tale becomes one with the bridal couple that she is leading, and the whole scene is warmed by an intense sun. This work was created in 1946, around the same period that Chagall decided to return to Europe for the first time since before the war, to reconnect with fellow artists and prepare for an upcoming retrospective of his work at the Musée d'Art Moderne de la Ville de Paris. The war had changed the once familiar France, and the artist remarked in a letter to Virginia, "France has changed a lot. I don't recognize it. America is more dynamic, but it is also more primitive. France is a picture already painted. America has still to be painted." Chagall would visit Paris again in October 1947 for the opening of his exhibition. After living in High Falls for 2 years, Chagall, Virginia, and the children left New York for France in August 1948. But after 7 years together, their relationship subsequently ended. The reception and appreciation of Chagall's work after the war was extraordinary, especially in Europe. The population had been shattered and traumatized by the horrors of the war and the Holocaust, and sought to come to terms with the experience of the previous 2 decades. Europeans longed for an art whose themes were love, spiritual renewal, and hope. Chagall was a Jewish artist, and as a Jewish artist, he was able to encapsulate the lost world in his vivid imagery. By employing a highly personal yet evocative visual language of symbols and formal strategies, he offered a narrative art that met the psychological needs of the moment and gave pleasure and consolation as could no other visual artist at that time.